Bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis, this is Tax Credit Tuesday. Sitting in today for Michael Novogradac, here's your host, Tony Grappone.
Hello, and welcome to Tax Credit Tuesday. I'm Tony Grappone, your host for today's episode, and this is the latest installment of our Renewable Energy Tax Credit Finance Series. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform or watching us on YouTube, we're glad you've joined us. Today, we're diving into a topic that's become increasingly important for developers, investors, and anyone involved in clean energy: the Foreign Entity of Concern, or FEOC rules. Complying with these rules further complicates qualifying for and monetizing clean energy tax credits and have big implications for project ownership, component supply chains, and more. To help us break it all down, I'm joined by my partner, Nicolo Pinoli, a leading expert in tax equity finance. We have a lot to cover, so if you're ready, let's get started. Nicolo, welcome to the show. For those of you who may not know you, could you briefly share your background and the work you do with clients navigating FEOC and related tax credit issues?
Thanks for having me, Tony. Great to be with you. We tend to work with a lot of our clients to help them understand and navigate this complex thicket of rules around FEOC. There's definitely a lot to know, a lot to understand, and a lot to apply. And so certainly initially, when our clients come to us, they're looking for help understanding the rules and figuring out how they apply to their specific project. In addition to all that education and analysis, it's also very common for us to come in and actually perform testing to evaluate and report on whether your specific project meets the minimum requirements specifically related to sourcing of components from non-covered nations. And in a minute, we're going to talk about all those rules and what are those non-covered nations.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's start by setting the stage for our listeners. Over the past few years, we've seen a growing emphasis on national security and supply chain resilience in U.S. policy, especially when it comes to clean energy. The FEOC rules are a direct response to these concerns, aiming to reduce reliance on certain foreign suppliers. FEOC has had increased attention over the past few months since the enactment of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or as I'll refer to as OBBBA. And we'll talk about that more today. But I just wanted to point out that the definition of FEOC actually predates OB3. It previously existed with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, and even in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill in 2021. But at that time, FEOC mostly focused on electric vehicles, electric batteries, and other concepts like Build America, Buy America. So, Nicolo, with that as a background, can you please walk us through what FEOC is and why it has become such a hot topic in the clean energy space?
Yeah, Tony, there's, I think, high level, at least in my reading of these rules and requirements, there's really four key critical restrictions that come with the FEOC rules. And as you mentioned, FEOC does stand for Foreign Entity of Concern. And as a result, these rules are really focused on the ability of foreign individuals and foreign organizations to have control and a high level of participation in our renewable energy programs. And you mentioned some of the earlier legislation. In some ways, this might even go back to, you and I can think about the energy shocks of the 70s and how that, I think, woke up a lot of Americans to the importance of having control over our energy future and destiny. But when you look at FEOC more specifically, and you think about what it restricts, it's focused on who's claiming the credit. And specifically, you cannot have a prohibited foreign entity that claims the credit. The second piece is where you source your components. And your components must be sourced from non-prohibited foreign entities. There is a fancy calculation such that you must meet certain minimum percentages of your components that are sourced from these non-prohibited foreign entities. Third, there are prohibitions on technology licensing. And to the extent that you have licenses on technology, then there are limits and even prohibitions on your ability to license from prohibited foreign entities. And sometimes we really group these last two together, but the fourth one in my mind really relates more broadly to other financial arrangements, such as making payments to or receiving loans from prohibited foreign entities and or even paying royalties to prohibited foreign entities. It broadly means, and the restriction is an attempt to limit the control that these prohibited foreign entities have over your project, such that they can't come in and limit your ability to choose who to sell your juice to or when you turn it on and off and things like that. So ultimately, when you look at it, bottom line is we're really focused on reducing our reliance on foreign suppliers and supply chains and potential foreign control over these projects from anyone or any organization connected with 4 countries. And these are what's called the covered nations. And these 4 countries, probably not hard to guess, but they include China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. And when you think about those 4 countries, ultimately, there's probably not a lot of renewable energy investors and or licensing and or production of materials and components coming out of North Korea, Russia, and Iran, at least not currently. But certainly China is the 800-pound gorilla. And I think ultimately that's where we're likely to see a lot of potential for some sticky wickets due to China being such a huge part of the renewable energy ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks. I absolutely agree. And that was a fantastic overview. Okay. It's interesting to note that despite the usual back and forth in Washington, right, there seems to be bipartisan support for these FEOC rules. As you mentioned, OB3 expanded FEOC's reach even further. Can you kind of take a moment and explain what changed with that legislation and why both parties seem to agree on keeping these rules in place?
Well, you're right that it seems like it's become a little bit of a spectator sport for those of us watching Washington, that we see rules going back and forth depending on who's in power. And some of my clients have even been asking, well, are these FEOC rules going to stick around? And I guess you never say never. You never know exactly what the future is going to hold, but certainly these rules do seem to have pretty broad bipartisan support. Due to a desire to reinvigorate our manufacturing base and reduce our reliance on foreign manufacturing, specifically Chinese manufacturing. And there's sort of this whole question around which credits are impacted. And there are a whole swath of new tax credits that are impacted, which I think we're going to get to in a minute. While it was pretty narrowly targeted before, now we're finding a much larger group of credits gets picked up with these FEOC rules.
Yeah, indeed. No doubt. Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful to point out to clients because as you noted, right, the tax policy from Washington, we're seeing sort of like seesaw style changes in tax policy here where you never know how far the pendulum can swing depending on which administration's in office, right? But with FEOC, if you're sort of reading the tea leaves here, you sort of get the feeling that there is bipartisan support for increasing our domestic manufacturing base and reducing our reliance on, at least Chinese manufacturing for sure. All right. So building on that, one of the biggest challenges we get from our clients is how do these rules affect my project's eligibility for tax credits? As we've noted, the FEOC rules touch on a wide range of credits, but there are some important exceptions and some grandfathering provisions at play here. Nicolo, can you break down which credits are impacted and maybe highlight some of the carve-outs that listeners should be aware of?
Sure. And as we work through it, we all know that there are a myriad of applicability dates that come into play here. So certain rules apply based on certain timelines and other rules don't apply because you've been grandfathered in. And I think the big one I want to highlight up front is that for projects that are started before December 31st, 24, so almost a year ago, if you started your project, you began construction, then FEOC just doesn't apply. So anyone who's got legacy projects, even projects that are coming online now, or they're working on coming online now, as long as you are able to meet that beginning of construction requirement by December 31st of last year, FEOC just plain doesn't apply. And so for those projects, congratulations, you get a pass on meeting these requirements. Of course, they will potentially apply to your new projects going forward, depending on the specific rule and your specific project. But let's talk about the 6 sections of the Internal Revenue Code that are impacted by the FEOC rules. And those 6 sections, one of them is in 48 and the other 5 are in 45, which makes it kind of fun to remember them. 48E is one of the huge impacted sections of the Internal Revenue Code. 45Q, U, X, Y, and Z are the other sections that are impacted by the FEOC rules. If you're struggling to remember those, here's my rule. You can't spell queen without Q and U. So that's my first start. Q and U are in. And then X, Y, and Z, those are the last 3 letters of the alphabet. So 48E, 45Q, U, X, Y, Z. Now, what are those all about? 48E, which I think is the big one that's going to affect a lot of projects. That's the tech neutral investment tax credit, which is obviously a huge deal for our clients. And generally speaking, it includes solar and wind developers who are planning to claim the ITC, which in my experience these days is the vast majority of solar and wind projects. If you switch gears over to 45Q is the carbon capture credit. 45U is for nuclear. 45X is the advanced manufacturing production tax credit. 45Y is the tech neutral production tax credit. So this one could come into play for groups who decide to opt for the production tax credit over the investment tax credit. But still, my experience is that's a minority of deals that take the PTC instead of the ITC. And finally, 45Z is the clean fuel production credit. So that's the universe of credits to which this applies. Good news, bad news is, well, it's pretty much most of the credits that we probably care about.
Right. Great. So yeah, and just to emphasize the credits that it doesn't apply to, you noted that, if a facility started construction before 2025 or by 12/31/2024, FEOC rules don't apply. And so we're talking about the old credits under section 45 and 48. So those, not only do you get the benefit of not having to comply with FEOC, but those credits may be in particularly high demand with investors and tax credit buyers. So not only do you not have to comply with FEOC, you may even have sort of expanded financing options when compared to some of these tech neutral credit provisions. All right. Excellent. Thank you, Nicolo. That was very helpful. Okay, moving on. Acronyms, definitions, and how to identify prohibited foreign entities. If you've spent any time reading FEOC guidance, you know that there's alphabet soup, so to speak, can get overwhelming. You've got FEOC, PFE, SFE, FIE, and more. Understanding these definitions is crucial for compliance, especially when it comes to identifying prohibited foreign entities and tracing their ownership or influence. So, Nicolo, can you help clarify what counts as a prohibited foreign entity or PFE, and then help us understand the difference between a specified foreign entity, SFE, and a foreign influenced entity, FIE?
Yeah, we're going to have some fun here. And I'm sure some of you listening to this at home are thinking, could they make it any more complicated? And Congress loves to borrow from existing definitions, existing concepts, because that way they don't have to create ideas out of whole cloth. Hey, we have this great idea that worked for this other thing over here. Let's just borrow it and reuse it for this new thing we're doing. And that's, I think, a big part of why we have all of these sweet definitions that we get to deal with. I think, too, you end up with these multiple definitions because my sense is that Congress looked at the rules, came up with one broad set of rules, and then sort of looked at it and thought, you know what, maybe that's great and all, but maybe there's some other fact patterns we're worried about, somebody making an end around those rules. So let's try and tighten it up even further in some situations with another definition that goes beyond that first definition. So let's take a look at what those key acronyms are. prohibited foreign entities. This is sort of the umbrella definition of entities that are problematic. And within that umbrella definition of prohibited foreign entities, or PFEs, you have two groups and really two subgroups. One is specified foreign entities. And I like to think of these conceptually as entities with close connections to covered nations. So what is an SFE, a specified foreign entity? It's an entity an SFE, if it is controlled by a foreign individual or a foreign government, as well as a citizen or a national of one of those covered nations. Now, there is an exception to that rule, that if someone is a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, then notwithstanding the fact they're a foreign citizen or foreign national, this rule doesn't apply to them. However, it also applies to entities organized and having their principal place of business in a covered nation, or an entity that's quote unquote controlled by one of these foreign controlled entities. And when we talk about control, in this case, it means having direct or indirect ownership of greater than 50%. So that's a specified foreign entity, which hopefully is as clear as mud. Separately, we have foreign influenced entities. And I think this is sort of the more indirect. That was very direct. This is a little more indirect. It's really entities that are influenced by covered nations, maybe don't have quite the same level of ownership, quite the same level of control, and yet they also get swept into these rules because of they're deemed to be influenced by a specified foreign entity. So what makes a foreign influenced entity, an FIE? I feel like saying fee, fi, fo, fum. An entity is a foreign influenced entity if, and this is looking at the last day of the tax year, which is good fun, but if on the last day of the tax year, if any SFE has the direct authority to appoint a covered officer of the entity, such as an executive or a board member, or if a single SFE owns at least 25% of the entity. So you see, we're sort of ratcheting down in the ownership and control in terms of what constitutes that level of ownership and control. Or any multiple combination of SFEs own at least 40% of the entity, or at least 15% of the entity's debt has been issued to specified foreign entities. That's an original issue, not based on who holds it after the original issue. Another way you can be an FIE is if you're an entity that makes a payment to an SFE during the previous year, pursuant to a contract which entitles the SFE to exercise effective control over any qualified facility of the taxpayer. Now, there's a whole bunch of details that would have to unpack to really get into that. And that's really the list. But even within each of those categories, there's a whole bunch of subcategories and subcategories and exciting rules and exceptions to the rules. Like I said before, my general sense is that Congress started wanting to limit SFE participation. They got paranoid that SFEs didn't go far enough and that somebody could get sneaky and find a way around the rules through indirect participation and control. And so they expanded those rules to also pick up the FIEs, the foreign influenced entities.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but your hunch certainly makes sense. They may have came out with the SFE rules first and thought that, wait a minute, we don't want to sort of anybody to be able to sort of get an end around here to complying with these rules. And then so they expanded the rules by adding the FIEs. Okay, excellent rundown of the various acronyms. Certainly a lot to unpack further as the whole FEOC compliance world evolves. Okay, let's get into some key issues for developers and investors. So as we dig deeper, it's clear that the FEOC compliance affects multiple aspects of project structuring and execution, from ownership to sourcing, technology licensing, financial arrangements. There are several layers to consider. Nicolo, earlier in the podcast, you identified the 4 main issues that listeners should be aware of. But can you walk us through these 4 main issues in more detail and why each one matters in practice?
Yeah, what do these rules mean and how do they impact my ability to get stuff done? And so let's go back to those 4 restrictions one at a time. You remember the first one was the restriction on who's claiming the credit, that prohibited foreign entities cannot claim the credit. And again, prohibited foreign entities, that's our big umbrella definition, which then boils down to the underlying 2 FIEs and SFEs. But the focus here, what does that mean for you if you're, say, a solar developer? And the real idea is that we want to make sure that prohibited foreign entities aren't benefiting from the credit. If our government is subsidizing this activity, we don't want that subsidy to end up benefiting one of these prohibited foreign entities. And that means both in terms of who is the project sponsor, but it also means who is the actual tax credit investor. I think in a lot of ways, there's probably a lot less to worry about on the tax credit investor side, because a lot of the tax credit investors are publicly traded American companies. And so therefore, as a result, you probably don't have a whole lot of concerns about foreign influence and them being SFEs. And there are, or PFEs for that matter. And there are special rules for publicly traded corporations that make it easier for them to avoid these rules and requirements. So I think that's sort of good news right out of the gate, is the investor is not likely, at least among traditional high volume investors in our credits, probably not going to be a huge issue there. But I do think when it comes to project sponsors, that's where you get into more exciting issues, especially to the extent that you have a large ownership group, or to the extent that you have private equity coming in as part of your project sponsor ownership group. And you end up having some foreign investors who ultimately, as you work your way up through the tiers, are part of your ownership group. And then it's just a question of looking through all your various contractual arrangements for your debt and your equity and seeing who owns this stuff and whether or not that means that now I've got a problem because I end up triggering one of these requirements. So that's the first one. Who can claim the credit? Second one, now we're on to your source components. And where am I getting my materials? Where am I getting my components? Is it coming from a prohibited foreign entity, a prohibited covered nation, or am I using domestic products, or am I using products that come from, it might be foreign, but not one of these covered nations? And the good news is that you don't have to hit 100%. So that's, I think, a boon in terms of what percentage of your project has to be from these non-covered nations or non-prohibited foreign entities. But the focus here is to make sure that you're hitting a minimum percentage. And certainly that requirement ends up rising over time. It starts out as a slightly lower percentage and then ends up rising to a higher percentage over time. And we're going to dig into it momentarily, but it will require a close scrutiny of the major components that make up your project and where they end up being sourced from. So that's number 2. Number 3 then is prohibitions on licensing technology from a prohibited foreign entity. And I think the primary focus with this requirement is preventing PFEs from really having a backdoor mechanism to physically control your project. And my sense is there's this paranoia that somewhere Chairman Xi is sitting with a button where he can just push it and turn off all the solar projects throughout the US. And certainly, I guess there's fear there, but also there's their ability to influence the operation of the project, right? If there is this requirement that you're licensing technology from this prohibited foreign entity, and they're able to, through that licensing arrangement, influence your project and affect your ability to deliver juice, then there's real fear about that. So that's number 3. Number 4 is other financial arrangements, prohibitions on engaging in other financial arrangements, such as making payments to, receiving loans from, or even paying royalties to prohibited foreign entities. And my sense is, as I read through all these rules, and it's a long list of potential transactions and contractual arrangements, but the real primary focus is trying to prevent PFEs from having a backdoor ability to strip out economic benefits or otherwise control the project. And in my experience, there is a bit of a trap for the unwary here, because things that you might not worry about traditionally, things like maintenance contracts and warranty arrangements, they have the potential to trip you up. So you do have to be pretty careful when you start looking at these other financial arrangements and other contractual arrangements.
Okay, wonderful. One of the second item that you discussed was around sourcing components and having to meet minimum percentages from non-prohibited foreign entities. And so that brings us to our next topic. What you kind of touched on there was the material assistance cost ratio and sourcing requirements. The material assistance cost ratio has gotten a lot of attention early on since these FEOC rules have been expanded to 40, the tech neutral credit provisions. So I'd like to kind of shift gears now to component sourcing. Again, it's a hot topic for manufacturers and developers. The ratio is at the heart, complying with this material assistance cost ratio is really at the heart of these requirements. And the percentages are high and they seem to increase over time. So, Nicolo, can you kind of walk us through how these ratios work, what the key deadlines are, and what guidance is available for developers?
All right. Finally, we get some math, something us accountants can really sink our teeth into. Because everything else we've talked about to this point has largely been more sort of less quantitative and more qualitative, looking at contracts, looking at relationships, looking at ownership. And this one now I get some fun math. And anytime you have a ratio, you must have a denominator and a numerator. And in this case, it's easiest to start with the denominator, which is really everything, my total labor and materials costs for all of my manufactured products that go into my project. Part of the fun is it does exclude structural elements like steel and rebar. So that's my denominator. What's all the labor and materials costs related to all these manufactured products? Now, okay, what's in the numerator then? And the numerator in a lot of ways, well, you start with the denominator and then you back some stuff out. And the stuff you're backing out is any costs of elements that are mined, produced, or manufactured by a prohibited foreign entity. And so as a result, when you start thinking about your math, a lot of people, I think the thing that they tend to get tripped up by is they think they're calculating the bad ratio. And instead, what this is really calculating is the good ratio, right? Since you're backing out all of those elements that have been mined, produced, or manufactured by a prohibited foreign entity in doing the calculation. So what is the ratio? What's the minimum I have to meet? The ratio for power projects, meaning wind and solar, for 2026 is 40%, which is kind of low. If I got 40% on a test in high school, I'd be failing. But all we need to hit here for 2026 is 40%. However, it's going to ramp up by 5% every year over the next few years until we get to 2030, at which point it'll hit 60% and it'll stick at that 60% level. I should note too, I mentioned these percentages apply to power projects like wind and solar, power generation projects. For other products like storage, battery storage, they actually have higher percentages that apply. So don't just think that, oh, I'm doing renewable energy, I'm getting a credit, therefore the 40% rising to 60 always applies to me. You've got to look very specifically at your product, at your project, and figure out whether or not a different percentage might happen to apply. Now, how do I go about looking at the math there? Do I actually have to go down to each individual nut and bolt and screw and figure out, oh, where did this one come from and where did that one come from? Because there's a lot of goodies that go into making up these projects. The good news is we've got tables. Everybody loves a table. And we have existing tables related to domestic content safe harbors. And Treasury has told us we can rely on those domestic content safe harbor tables for now until such time as they issue updated tables. Those updated tables aren't expected probably for another 12 months. So we should be able to continue to use those tables for a while. Those tables can be used for battery storage, onshore wind, and solar. So you notice offshore wind is not included and other technologies are also not included. And if you've never looked at the tables, they're fascinating. So I encourage you to go and take a look. And it turns out they tend to be very precise about the type of project you're looking at. Is it solar? Is it wind? Is it battery? And then even within that, they slice and dice it in different ways in terms of, is it ground mounted? Is it mounted on a roof? And if so, then you have different components, right? You have various solar PV module elements that come into play. You've got the inverter, you've got the tracking system. And in my mind, when you really boil it all down, the cells themselves are often the single biggest piece that's in the table. Because if you look at the percentages, they're often alone. They're often 40, 50, in some cases, even as high as 60%. And so if you get the cells themselves, if you're doing solar PV, of course, if you get the cells themselves from a non-covered nation, from a non-PFE source, then chances are you might be most of the way there, even all the way there, potentially, if you're placing in service in 2026. So that's good news, but also bad news, because guess what? Most of the cells these days come from a covered foreign nation. So that makes it that much more challenging to meet this requirement in some ways. Tony, back to you. I'd be interested in your insights and observations around this ratio and how you're seeing your clients grapple with meeting it.
Right. So, we've got clients that are used to meeting the adder, the 10% adder for domestic content. And so for those developers, they kind of have procurement strategies in place and a good understanding of how to comply with the domestic content rules. And so that group of developers, I think they feel a little bit more sort of educated and feel like they've got a bit of a strategy that they can deploy to, be ready to comply with FEOC requirements and meet this material assistance cost ratio. And then we've got other clients that they've never really had to sort through the domestic content rules before. And so that group of developers naturally is a little bit more intimidated by these FEOC rules because they're starting from scratch here with no sort of foundational experience and knowledge to leverage. So right now, again, sort of our domestic content clients are a little more armed and ready and feeling more confident with their ability to comply with FEOC. And then everybody else is kind of a little more in panic mode and trying to quickly wrap their arms around what this all means and how they're going to develop a strategy to comply. So it's interesting, but that was great. I appreciate the walkthrough on the ratio and your color commentary. All right, let's talk about effective dates, penalties, and recapture risks. Timing is super important here. FEOC's no exception. There are important effective dates as well as significant penalties and recapture risks for non-compliance. So, Nicolo, can you do me a favor? Can you outline when these rules take effect, what the consequences are for non-compliance, and any special recapture provisions that you think our listeners should be aware of?
Okay. So first thing, when do these rules apply? And they are generally effective for tax years starting after July 4th, 2025, which is a funny way of approaching it, but most taxpayers are calendar year taxpayers, not all of them, but most are. And if in that situation, what it really means is these rules apply starting in 2026. So really next year, but hey, guess what? We're almost there. We're only 2.5 months away from 2026. Now, but then there's some other elements we have to unpack. One of them, we talked about the material assistance percentage requirement when we started talking about needing to meet 40% that rises over time. If you start your construction by 12/31/25, and that's a whole different thing to unpack, whether or not you've started construction, but if you can meet that requirement to start construction by 12/31/25, which is coming up here in about 10 weeks, then the material assistance percentages don't apply, which makes your life a whole lot easier in many ways when it comes to meeting the FEOC rules, because that is a huge part in terms of sourcing your components to not have to worry about where my stuff is coming from. So that's another exciting effective date rule. There's one more that I really wanted to mention, which relates to what's called the 10-year recapture risk. And when we start talking about these various payments and contractual arrangements that give effective control to a specified foreign entity, they only apply to projects where you're claiming the investment tax credit in a tax year starting after July 4th, 2027. And the bill actually says in a tax year that begins after 2 years after the enactment date, which again, if you really boil it down and say, well, if I'm a calendar year taxpayer, what does that mean? It means starting in 2028 is when these rules apply related to giving effective control to SFEs and being subject to this 10-year recapture risk, which is a pretty draconian and heavy duty recapture risk, where if 8 years after I place in service, I make a payment that triggers this requirement, that says, oh, now you've just given control to a specified foreign entity. All of a sudden it recaptures those tax credits from 8 years ago, which is a little bit nuts to consider that you might end up in that kind of a position. But I think it sort of highlights the sensitivity and the stakes involved in making sure that you comply with these rules. And the fact that this specific rule goes out for all of 10 years, even though ordinarily there's only a 5-year recapture period related to renewable energy. But let's talk a little bit more about what those penalties are, because it's important to note that if you fail to meet the FEOC requirements, let's say you really are an SFE and you're trying to claim the credit, or let's say you fail to meet that 40% test and instead you're at 39.9%. What does that mean? It means that you lose all your credits. There's 100% disallowance of all the credits that you claim. So that's a big deal. That's a huge deal. On top of that, there's also a 20% underpayment penalty that's applied to the investor based on the investor's underpayment of their tax liability. So not only do you lose all your credits, but then you have this bonus 20% penalty that gets tacked on top of that. There's a third element to potential penalties here that we really haven't poked at, but when you start thinking about the components and getting to that minimum percentage level, one of the approaches that we're seeing people take is to start looking at their suppliers and having those suppliers provide certificates to say, yeah, my stuff is all coming from a non-covered nation. And then relying on these certificates as you start doing your math and your calculations around whether or not you meet the minimum requirements. So there's a penalty around these certificates. And to the extent that you're a component manufacturer and you actually go out and you provide false certificates, you say, yes, I'm getting my stuff from a non-covered nation, but it turns out you're actually getting your stuff from a covered nation, then there's a 10% penalty that applies to you as the provider of that false certificate.
Those are some stiff penalties indeed. It makes me wonder, with that 10-year recapture risk that starts for projects that place in service in 2028 and later. I don't know if you know how solar and wind, they kind of accelerated the phase out of those tax credits to where they want those facilities to be placed in service before the end of 2027, unless they can demonstrate that they started construction on it before certain dates. It makes me think that, the IRS and Treasury didn't put in that same kind of phase out for the other technologies. They were really specific with wind and solar, but it makes me wonder with this 10-year recapture risk for facilities that place in service in 2028 and later, if they were really trying to put in almost like a poison pill for clean energy tax credits in general for after 2027, because that seems like a pretty significant, recapture risk for investors and developers. All right. So Nicolo, you went through a lot there. That was great, but how can you help clients? So you obviously know a lot about FEOC. How does Novogradac help clients understand and sort of document their FEOC compliance?
Yeah, as you probably are all realizing, there are a lot of rules here and they get really complicated in a hurry. And a big part of what we do is just consulting with our clients to help apply these rules to their specific projects. And because different rules apply to almost every deal, depending on when it's coming online, the type of technology you're using, even sort of as you start to drill down within the various types of projects within those technologies, every single project has to individually assess and conclude on how these rules will apply. And the penalty is steep. And so as a result, there's a real benefit to making sure that you get it right. And that's where we come in. We're here to help. We work with clients all day, every day to help them work through the rules, assess how the rules apply to them, and then help them figure out and make sure that they're complying with the rules on a go-forward basis. But wait, there's more. On top of just helping our clients figure it out, many of our clients actually want us to issue reports, especially when it relates to that material assistance cost ratio. We can come in and do analysis, do calculations, and actually perform an agreed upon procedures report. And really this comes in handy for project sponsors and even investors who want to make sure that they've got documentation around their compliance, and not just documentation, but documentation that someone else has looked at it, and not just anyone, but really a third-party expert has come in, looked at everything that they're doing, tested their conclusions, and then issued a report on letterhead, signed, sealed, and delivered, showing that you really have complied, and that's something they can put in their files and help them feel really confident about their compliance with the materials assistance cost ratio requirements.
Definitely. Yep. Agreed. So some basic consulting just to better understand the rules, begun construction consulting, right? So clients out there may be thinking, wow, these FEOC rules sound super complicated. I'd like to avoid them to the extent possible. Maybe I'll try and see what I can do to start construction before 2026. And so, the firm offers a lot of consulting and even some AUP services to help document that when you began construction. So we can help there too. Material assistance cost ratios. We've got some clients reaching out to us saying, look, we don't plan on starting construction until next year, but we want to get a template sort of set of documents and work papers in place right now based on contemplated contractual terms to project, if you will, our FEOC compliance. And investors most likely are going to require some kind of third party to look over developer shoulders and issue some kind of report around their FEOC compliance profile. And that's where these AUP services can come in super handy. All right. So Nicolo, you shared a lot of great insights today and definitely convinced us of your expertise. And so we'll be sure to include Nicolo's contact information in today's show notes so you can reach out and learn more about FEOC compliance. But before we go, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform and share this episode with colleagues who you think can benefit from these discussions. And if you're watching on YouTube, we'd appreciate it if you'd like and comment. It helps others discover these important conversations. And one of my favorite parts of doing these podcasts is the end where we do the industry shout out. And so today I get to ask Nicolo, usually I'm the one giving the shout outs as a guest, but today I get to play host and I get to ask Nicolo who he'd like to give a shout out to. So Nicolo, who would you like to give a shout out to this week?
Yeah, I'd love to give a shout out to one of our colleagues and good friends, Nick Ehrman, who is legal counsel with Kutak Rock, and who we've had lots of fun adventures with through various different incentive programs, in addition to having lots of fun adventures together on the renewable energy side.
Awesome. Great shout out. I agree with that. So, and Nick's actually going to join Nicolo and I in DC. We've got our renewable energy finance conference coming up the first week in November. It's November 5th, 6th, and 7th, I believe, and it's at the Fairmont in Washington, D.C. On Wednesday during the pre-conference workshop, Nicolo, and I are going to do a bit of a deeper dive on FEOC compliance. And so if you're thinking about going to the conference and attending the workshop and you'd like to learn more about FEOC, you can catch us there. And then Nick Ehrman's also going to be on our tax issues panel on Thursday afternoon. So I'd echo Nicolo's shout out to Nick Ehrman. All right, great. So Nicolo, thanks for being our guest today. And to our audience, I'm Tony Grappone. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.